showed up at the Pentagon along with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That is Pete Williams, who is the normal Pentagon briefer. We will spare our audience any further political analysis of the President's speech. We'll come back to it. This is clearly a briefing that the entire nation, in fact, much of the world, will hang on, the Secretary of Defense.
Well, thank you very much, Pete. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you all heard the speech a short time ago by the President. And while there is not a great deal we can add now, we did want to be as forthcoming as we can with you. At 7 o'clock tonight, as you all know by now, Eastern Time, 3 o'clock Thursday morning in the Gulf, the armed forces of the United States began an operation at the direction of the President to force Saddam Hussein to withdraw his troops from Kuwait and to end his occupation of that country. At the direction of the President, I signed the execute order yesterday afternoon to undertake this operation, subject to certain conditions. It was to begin only after we'd met the terms of the resolution passed last Saturday by the Congress. Those conditions have been complied with and proper notice has been given as required. And the operation was not to take place if there had been any last-minute diplomatic breakthroughs. The operation underway tonight, taking place in the pre-dawn darkness of the Persian Gulf, involves Allied air forces of 4 nations: the United States, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. As they undertake their missions, they do so after months of careful planning. At the direction of the President, great care has been taken to focus on military targets, to minimize U.S. casualties, and to do everything possible to avoid injury to civilians in Iraq and Kuwait. The targets being struck tonight are located throughout Iraq and Kuwait. Our focus is on the destruction of Saddam Hussein's offensive military capabilities, the very capabilities that he used to seize control of Kuwait and that make him a continuing threat to the nations of the Middle East. These are the same capabilities that now threaten American and Allied forces in the Gulf. Our goal, the same one we have maintained throughout Operation Desert Shield, is to liberate Kuwait and enforce the resolutions of the UN Security Council. This portion of the campaign, directed against Saddam Hussein's offensive military force, is an enormously complex undertaking. It involves all of the services of the United States military and hundreds of U.S. and Allied aircraft. It is an ongoing operation, and we must therefore limit the kind and the amount of information that we provide in these early stages. This obviously is different from what happened in Panama in December of 1989, where most of the operation was over by the morning of the first day. We understand your need for information about what will happen next, and we are well aware of our obligation to keep the American people informed. But you must also understand that we cannot talk about future operations without putting at risk the safety of those who will have to carry them out. I believe I can speak for all of us at the Pentagon tonight when I say that we had hoped to settle this matter peacefully. This has clearly been an agonizing decision for the President and the Congress of the United States. And we've reached the point of committing our forces to battle very reluctantly, only after the most careful consideration. But no one should doubt our ability and our resolve to carry out our mission and to achieve our objective. I have great confidence in the professionalism, the dedication, and the determination of the men and women of our armed forces. They are, without question, the finest young sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines this nation has ever sent in harm's way. I want to assure all Americans that we will do our very best to carry out the President's orders as quickly and efficiently as possible and at the lowest cost possible. We'd be happy to respond to a few questions.
General Powell, can you describe the Iraqi Air Force's resistance, if any, their losses so far, and to what extent do you think that you've already achieved air superiority there?
Well, the operation's only 2.5 hours old, so I'm not quite prepared to take on your second question. So far, there has been no air resistance.
Can you tell us if there's been any casualties so far?
We will, at the appropriate time, be releasing information on casualties. We're not prepared to release any specifics now. I will simply say that the preliminary reports we have received in terms of the success of the operation, and that includes the possibility of casualties, have been very, very encouraging. The operation appears to have gone very well.
Has there been any Iraqi
What can you tell
response
us
of any
about the
kind?
Scud missiles that have been reportedly launched by Iraq?
There have been a number of reports of Scud missiles, but insofar as I am aware, they basically are false reports. General Powell may want to say
Give us a
something.
rundown on the types of aircrafts and numbers that were involved in the raids.
I really can't at this time because it is an ongoing operation. Let me just say that it involved the Air Forces mentioned by Secretary Cheney and sorties in the hundreds.
Could you tell us were there cruise missiles involved with that?
I won't comment on specific weaponry. It's an ongoing operation.
What targets were we bombing near Baghdad, and have we bombed any facilities where we think Saddam Hussein might be?
We have not been targeting Mr. Saddam Hussein. The purpose of our bombing facilities in the area of Baghdad is essentially to go after the command and control system of the Iraqi armed forces. And we're looking at principally military targets, command and control installations, air defense sites that could put our planes at risk, but they are militarily oriented targets.
Have you heard any Iraq response of any kind?
The response of the Iraqi forces at this point has been limited, I think would be the best way to characterize it. But again, let me emphasize, as General Powell did, we're in the very early stages of this operation. It is likely to run for a long period of time. I realize you've all got legitimate questions about it, but there simply are things we do not know yet because it is an ongoing operation, because pilots are just now returning, and there'll be a lot of work required to assess the success of the initial efforts, and there'll be a lot of follow-up work required as well.
Could you tell us, please, whether or not there have been any indications whatsoever that the Iraqi troops, the 540,000 Iraqi troops in the Kuwaiti theater, have been cut off from their command and control headquarters in Baghdad?
I wouldn't want to speculate on that at this point, Wolf.
Mr. Secretary, can I follow up, please?
Sure.
Can I follow up? The President said this was strictly an air operation for the time being. When does the U.S. decide to send in the ground forces?
It is strictly an air operation for the time being, and I wouldn't want to speculate on the point at which additional forces might be engaged.
Have your targets tonight, or did any Navy planes take place?
Murat said on the McNeil Air News Hour this evening that we are, quote, now prisoners of our own country, in our own country. Now that we've defended ourselves from naked aggression in the Middle East, how do we defend ourselves here at home from terrorist attacks?
I'm confident that we can deal with the terrorist threat.
Have our targets thus far included tanks and artillery?
I don't want to get into specific target sets yet. As the information comes in and builds over time, and we can give it to you historically, we will give it out, but I'm not prepared to go into specific target sets and what targets have been hit and have not, because it really is just too early to give you that kind of bomb damage assessment.
If Saddam Hussein says tomorrow, I give up, I'm sorry, I will withdraw from Kuwait, will you pause have a pause in your air campaign, or will you continue with it until you knock out all the priority targets?
I will do whatever the President of the United States directs us to do through the Secretary of Defense.
Secretary Cheney, from a military perspective, what went into your thinking in deciding to launch the attack at this point this evening? What were the factors?
Well, I think there were several factors. Of course, the President made the basic decision to commit the force. It was affected by, among other things, the expiration of the United Nations deadline that had been set on November 30th when the Security Council voted for the use of any means necessary to get him out. I think it was affected in part as a result of consultation with our allies, but it also was based upon the advice of our senior military commanders in terms of picking a time when conditions appeared to be most favorable for undertaking the operation. Let me emphasize, though, that the procedure we went through was to plan for execution of the operation at a point after the expiration of the United Nations deadline, but I had no authority to execute the plan until the President instructed me yesterday afternoon to do so, and it was at that point that we signed out the execute order with the qualifiers I mentioned in my opening statement.
Those favorable factors, can you tell us what some of those were?
I think I just leave it leave it where it is.
Are you surprised that there was no response, or a very small response from the Iraqi forces at this point?
Again, I'm reluctant to characterize the response beyond what we've already said about it. We've not had an opportunity to debrief our pilots yet. Some of them are still flying missions, and I think it would be inappropriate at this point to convey the notion that somehow we've got a final fix on it. But I think it would be fair to say, and General Powell may well want to comment on this, that the initial reaction from the Iraqis is such that I'm generally of the opinion that we achieved a fairly high degree of tactical surprise.
Has there been Israel or Turkey on the part of Iraq?
None to my knowledge.
Mr. Secretary, could you tell us, the President mentioned that one of the objectives was to take out chemical and nuclear sites. Can you tell us in a general way if that mission was accomplished?
I can say that we have, in fact, gone after those targets. I do not yet have information on the effectiveness of those efforts.
Mr. Secretary, what about word of casualties at Baghdad? You indicated you wanted to spare civilians there. Do you have any sense about how that may or may not have occurred in the city? There was a lot of bombing, obviously, in Baghdad.
The best reporting that I've seen on what transpired in Baghdad was on CNN. And it would appear, based upon the comments that were coming in from the CNN crew in the hotel in Baghdad, that the operation was successful in striking targets with a high degree of precision. At least that's the reporting according to CNN.
Was there an Iraqi attempt to launch missiles, sir?
Do you have any
We've had reports of missile launches, but none of them have been confirmed.
What about the Scuds in western Iraq at those air bases on the border? Have you got any reading on that? Are those fairly high priority targets?
Yes, they are a fairly high priority target.
And how'd you do?
I'm not prepared to say how we did or what we've done so far.
I'll follow up on that. So at the end of this operation, this phase of the operation, when you get a little better picture, and could you come back or have one of your staff come back and give us a briefing on it?
You'll be getting regular briefings, and we'll be, as the Secretary said, we're going to be as forthcoming as we possibly can, while at the same time preserving operational security.
Are you confident that your targeting of command and control sites has left Saddam Hussein the ability to, number one, know what's happening to his forces, and number two, to communicate to you that he wants to quit if he does decide so?
Again, Melissa, I don't have any information at this point on the overall effectiveness of the operation. What I said was the preliminary reports are very positive, but we are in the very earliest stages of this, and therefore there's not a lot of detailed information we can give you on what the effect of the bombing campaign has been on specific strategic categories of targets.
Is there a Navy aircraft participate?
Pardon?
Is there a military commander like Saddam Hussein still alive to surrender if there's such a decision?
I really don't have anything I can give you on that.
Did you know where Saddam was when the attacks began, and was that a target even though he was not the target?
We have not been tracking Mr. Saddam Hussein for the purpose of targeting him.
General, can you characterize in any general way how long the current beginning phase of this operation will continue? That is, the air operation will be the rest of I guess, tonight and tomorrow morning, or throughout tomorrow? Give people any kind of general idea how long this first phase will...
The air part of the campaign will continue until the whole campaign is completed. It doesn't end.
Do you believe the threat of a missile attack by the Iraqis has been eliminated at this point?
I cannot answer that at this time until we get some assessments in.
Damage to any oil facilities at all?
I don't have bomb damage assessment yet. I can't answer that question.
General, how massive is this first wave? Are we talking 500 missions, 1,000 missions tonight?
I think tomorrow we'll be in a better position to try to give you a handle on that, but this early in the operation, I'm reluctant to give those numbers out until I've had a chance to talk to General Schwarzkopf in greater detail.
General Powell, when you say hundreds of sorties...
All U.S. services were involved in this part of the campaign.
When you say, General Powell, that there were hundreds of sorties, does that mean that there were not more than 1,000?
I think I'll leave it at that, between a bread box or something else. Hundreds of sorties. Thank you all. Thank you.
Well, for those people around the country who are hungry, as I think probably the whole country is, for a measure of operational information, the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs are being very clear. Either they won't release information now for what the Chairman calls operational security, or in some cases they simply do not know, which is, at this point in any campaign, a perfectly legitimate answer, because as they point out, pilots are still in the sky. This was an entirely air operation up until now. There have been no ground forces committed to the battle as of yet, and some of the pilots are either still up in the air or are back at their bases and have not been fully debriefed. But the President set the tone in his remarks that the U.S. Air Force, and as it is confirmed by the Secretary, the British and the French, and in some way, we're not quite sure how yet, the Saudis and the Kuwaitis are involved in the initial attack, have been going for the offensive military capability of Saddam Hussein in Kuwait and Iraq. That, I assume, means they're going for almost everything that in any way, shape, or form could assist the war effort, but we'll talk to our military analysts in just a moment. The Kuwaiti Air Force, which fled tactical retreat, one might say, at the early hours of the Iraqi invasion back on the 2nd of August and flew out of the country, has been residing for some 5.5 months in eastern Saudi Arabia. They fly both U.S. and French aircraft. They fly the A-4, the American Skyhawk, and they also fly a French Mirage, something called an F-1. And we saw them over Thanksgiving sitting on the edge of an airbase in eastern Saudi Arabia, sitting there looking rather lonely, but with Free Kuwait on the side. They now regard themselves as the Air Force of Free Kuwait, and they have been involved in some way, so says the Secretary, in the campaign this evening.